Hello, we're back. Thank you. And before we start, I want to introduce you to someone. Here is Methuselah. I could not resist naming him Methuselah because Methuselah is recorded to be the oldest living person on earth. Let me get him facing you. Hold on. Where is the nose? Ah, I feel the nose. Okay. So Methuselah was the oldest person that ever lived on the face of the earth. You can read all about him somewhere like right here in the toes, way in the beginning of the Bible. Okay. All right, I'll put him away and we will get started with a quick recap of what we did in the last videos. We know that under the leadership of Moses, the children of Israel escaped Egypt, and they stayed in the desert for 40 years. Then, under the leadership of Joshua, they conquered the promised land, and after it was conquered, they divided the country by lot uh, amongst all the tribes except the tribes of Levi. The Levites were priests, they were not given land but cities throughout the country. Okay? So now, after Joshua died, all the separate regions were under local government. It was no longer a central government. And they had problems. There were still a lot of enemy armies that were fighting them. So we read that in the book of Judges that over the period of about 200 years, they were fighting battles all along, and the judges or the troubleshooters were the ones that got them out of trouble. And we remember names like Gideon and Samson, and also a lady called Deborah. So many more judges, but now we end the book of Judges and start in the small book of Ruth. And in Ruth, we read that Ruth married a man from Bethlehem. Bethlehem is a very important name in the Bible. Bethlehem, as you remember from the Christmas story, is where Jesus Christ was born. So the man Boaz married Ruth, and they became the great grandparents of David. And we are going to hear about David in the next session. So here we go. 1 and 2 Samuel. Very important books, because with this we are going to be introduced to David. Samuel is a young man who was raised in the house of a priest. The priest was called Eli, and Eli was one of the last judges in the country. When Samuel was about 12 years old, he clearly heard from God, and he got the reputation that he was a true prophet, because what Samuel said on behalf of God, it came to pass. And what a prophet really is it's someone who hears from God. God says, say this to the people. Then the prophet will go to the people and say, God says this and this and this. Other times people go to a prophet and say, can you ask God such and such, such and such? Then the prophet will go to God, hears from him, and then gives the people God's answer. So the function of a prophet was very important in the country. Battles were won or lost based on whether they obeyed God through the prophet or not. And we see that over the following years, again, just like in the book of Judges and just like in the desert, when they obey God, God blesses them. When they disobey God, God will punish them. So Samuel gained the respect and the fear of the people because he heard from God. And what he heard and said to the people came to pass. Now Samuel got old and he had two sons who really did not walk the way their father did. And the people started to complain. And they said, "We don't want your sons as our judges. We want a king." And Samuel went to God and said, "God, they want a king." Samuel was told by God, "Go tell them that they can have their king, but let them know that kings come expensive." So Samuel went to the people and said, "Okay, you can have your God, but realize that kings demand all your sons to be in his army, all your daughters to work in his palace. He expects you to give taxes to him. He wants your vineyards. He wants your harvests. Kings come expensive." Well, the people said, "We don't care. We want a king. We want someone who we can see, someone that will lead us into war." So Samuel went back to God and said, "Okay, they are wanting a king." So God said to Samuel, "I will send a young man to you who you will recognize, and you can anoint him to be their king." So a little while later, out of the tribe of Benjamin, there was a young man who was head and shoulders taller than all the other people. He was tall, dark, and handsome. His name was Saul, and he was favored by the people. Now, there was another situation where an enemy army was opposite of the people of an area called Jabez Gilead. And they told the people, "We will let you live if you become our servants, but also we're going to poke all your right eyes out." Well, people didn't like that part, so they said, "Give us 7 days to think about it." So in the meantime, they sent word to Saul, and Saul got very angry. And Saul got an army together, and hundreds of thousands of soldiers marched on to Jabez Gilead, and they won the victory. And that was so significant that Saul was immediately crowned to be the king over Israel. And in the beginning years of Saul as a king, he did all right. He obeyed God, he obeyed Samuel, but then little by little, his head got too big. And on two occasions, he disobeyed bearably, horribly. And the last time he disobeyed, God was so angry, he said to Samuel, "Tell Saul that he is going to lose the kingdom, and I will anoint another man who is better than Saul to become the next king." So Samuel told that to Saul, and it says in the Bible that the Spirit of God left Saul, and an evil spirit came upon him. In the meantime, Samuel was sent by God to the town of Bethlehem. And in the town of Bethlehem, there was a man called Jesse who had 8 sons, and all the 7 sons paraded by Samuel. But Samuel said, "No, that's not him. No, that's not him. Do you have another son?" They said, "Yes, the youngest. He is the shepherd boy. He's in the field with the sheep." Well, Samuel said, "Bring him over." Okay, so they brought David over, and David was the young man who was chosen by God to become the next king. So Samuel anointed David to be the next king. He was not king right away. Anyhow, going back to Saul, Saul had trouble falling asleep. The evil spirit was on him, and his advisor said, "We know a young man who plays the harp beautifully and can sing really beautifully, and he can help you." So they sent young David to Saul, and he played for him, and Saul loved David. It really helped him when David was singing for him. So anyhow, he liked David. Well, there came a battle. This time it was the Philistines. The Philistines set up their army in array up on a hill, and on the other side of a valley was the Israeli army under the leadership of King Saul. In the middle of the valley, this is called the Valley of Elah, was a giant of a man, and you probably have heard of him. His name was Goliath. Goliath was Goliath was 9 feet tall, and everybody in the Israeli army was scared of Goliath. In the meantime, David's father Jesse said to David, "Hey, your three oldest brothers are fighting with Saul. Go bring them food." So young David went to bring food to his brothers. And when he got to the valley of Elah, he heard Goliath yelling and screaming at the army. So David went to King Saul and he said, "Why is this uncircumcised heathen insulting the army of the living God? I will fight him." And King Saul looked at David and he said, "You're just a youth." And David said, "Hey, listen, I killed a lion and I killed a bear. I can kill him." And then King Saul said something that is astonishing to me. I still don't understand it. He said, "Okay, you can fight him." So here's young David. He takes his slingshot and he takes 5 smooth stones, puts them in his pocket, and he runs up to Goliath. And he swings his sling and he shoots a stone right into Goliath's forehead. The stone actually sinks into his forehead. Goliath drops down. David jumps on him, takes Goliath's own sword, and whacks his head off. The Philistines are so scared now that their hero is dead that they go run. This encourages the Israeli army to chase him, and they win the victory. Okay, they win the battle, not the victory. They win the battle. And before that, King Saul had promised that whosoever would kill Goliath, he would give his daughter to marry him. Well, this happened. Now David became King Saul's son-in-law with Saul's daughter Micah. The daughters and the women of Israel were so happy. They were singing, "Oh, King Saul kills his 1,000, but David kills his 10,000." And that made King Saul jealous, very jealous. So jealous that on 2 occasions he actually threw a spear at David trying to kill him. But David escaped. And now we enter into a time frame for David where he was on the run for his father-in-law. For years he was on the run. He was hiding in caves. He was hiding in the fields. Um, at at one time, he had a group of about 600 people around him. He went to close to the seaside to a town of Carmel, where a rich man lived, and he asked him for food, and the man refused. This got David very angry. He was ready to go and fight them. But this man's wife, by the name of Abigail, she was very smart, and she saddled up a whole bunch of donkeys with a lot of food and brought it to David, who was approaching with his army. So that really helped. There was no battle that day. But Abigail's husband, 10 days later, died. David looked at Abigail and said, "Okay, I would like you to be my wife." So she became King David's wife, except he was not king yet. He was still just David. But he was very much favored by the people in the south. Well, he kept running and running. Eventually, David ended up in the country of the Philistines, where he had befriended one of the Philistine kings. and the king let him live there. Um, well, there was another battle. This time it was between the Philistines and King Saul and his army. And it was during this time, this battle, that both King Saul and his son Jonathan both ended up dead. So this was the time for the people who really liked David to crown David king. King David now lived in Hebron, and another son of King Saul became the king in the north. Now this is important. This is a very clear division between north and south. And that division you can read throughout the Old Testament and well into the gospel messages. The north and south in Israel have been at odds with each other for a long time. So the other son of King Saul eventually got killed, and now the entire kingdom was under the control of David. King David moved to Jerusalem, where he had a house built, a house made out of cedar. And God still lived in the tent, the tabernacle, that they made way back when they were in the desert. But they had moved it to Jerusalem. King David said to Nathan the prophet, "You know what? I will build God a temple." And that night, Nathan was told by God, "Tell David that he is not to build a temple. His son will build the temple." And that is because David had blood on his hand. David, even though he had blood on his hand, made a lot of mistakes, but was still, as it says in the Bible, a man after God's own heart. Every time before a battle, David would go to God and say, "God, shall I go up to these enemies?" And then God would say yes or no. Or God would say, "Do it this way." And David obeyed. So time and time again, by obeying God, um, David's army won the battles. And the kingdom grew, and the kingdom grew, and it grew. And it got to the peak that it has ever been. There has never been a time in Israel that was better than this time. They call it the golden era of the kingdom of Israel under King David. And to this day, Jewish people long to go back to the time that King David was their king. God had promised to David, "Out of your ancestry, out of your lineage, there will be a king on the throne forever and ever and ever." And we know, of course, that that is Jesus Christ. Now, if we look at Methuselah here, we have now arrived, let me see, okay, right here at the bottom of the rib cage. This is the heart, basically the center of the Bible, right here in the middle. King David, King David, King David. You will hear it 1,000 times. King David, a man after God's own heart. But King David made a giant, giant mistake. One day, while the army was fighting somewhere, King David was in the palace, and he went to the rooftop and he looked over the city, and on another rooftop he saw a beautiful woman bathing. Her name was Bathsheba. King David ordered her into the palace and into his bedroom, and she got pregnant. To cover his sin, he had her husband killed. And then he married Bathsheba, and the child that was conceived ended up dying. They had another child whose name was Solomon, and it was Solomon who would become the next king, which we will cover in future episodes. But King David, even though he made that huge, huge mistake, he repented of his sin and asked God for forgiveness, and God did forgive him for that horrible sin. But the country was never the same anymore. It never grew from here, and actually it just started to peter down. So one of the situations that happened was that one of King David's older sons, by the name of Absalom, got very full of himself, and he got the favor of all the people, and he actually arranged to oust his father, King David. So now David is on the run again, this time not for his father-in-law, but for his own son. Well, eventually his son died, was killed, and the kingdom was restored to David. Now David was getting old and feeble, and here is yet another attempt by one of his sons to take over the kingdom. And they're actually having a banquet party celebrating that the older son is going to be the next king. And Nathan the prophet heard about this, and he quickly went to Bathsheba and he said, "Did you hear this?" And she said, "No." "Well, go tell King David." So she told her husband, King David, and he said, "Get Nathan the prophet, get Zadok the priest. Come on, let's go anoint Solomon right now." So they did. They anointed Solomon to be the next king. The older brother heard about that, and he was now scared for his life. And he talked with Solomon, and Solomon said, "Do not worry, go to your home." King David was now very, very old, and he was cold in bed at night, and they found him a beautiful woman who warmed him up in bed. And um, it was not long after that that King David, as it says in the Bible, slept with his fathers. And right now we come to the beginning of the book of Kings, First Kings. This is a little bit of an overlap. Um, so he hasn't died in the book of 1 and 2 Samuel yet. That happens in the book of Kings. But I'll just jump a little bit ahead of time. So this is the end of the life of King David, one of the most influential people in the history of the Bible, of the Jewish people. So we'll leave it off here for this time, and we'll see you next time. And remember, faith comes by hearing, and hearing from the Word of God. Thank you.